last decade or so, there's been this expectation that the kids get all this stuff, they're super high tech, they're doing it all the time. But the reality is that a lot of the students don't actually have any particularly sophisticated methods of engaging with technology.
Now, when they do have the infrastructure, and having said it's not about the technology, infrastructure being things like Wi-Fi networking that will cope, single sign-on authentication at their university across different campuses, so all of the infrastructure, as long as that's all happening, student use does seem to certainly match in the teaching and learning area, as long as, and probably one of the key messages I'd like to deliver today, as long as there is professional development of not only staff, but students. They need to be shown how to use this technology in teaching and learning. Pedagogy needs to change, adopt, adapt. And here's an example of one student's impression. Now, Ohio State years ago went for what they call the Digital First Project. They've digitized a pile of stuff, they've integrated mobile devices, iPads into the curriculum, and the feedback's very positive.
He uses his class time specifically for you to ask questions and get some feedback responses from the students. It's very interactive and students love it.
And I'm seeing this at all sorts of universities. In fact, if we use that jargon, the flipped classroom, nursing at the University of Western Sydney don't have lectures anymore. They question the value of the didactic lecture. Now, that may be ironic because I'm lecturing you. So clearly, in some circumstances, the lecture is appropriate. What they do instead is they give students access to all of the content before face-to-face experience in large seminar groups, small seminar groups. Let's watch this space and see where it goes. Is there actually any evidence that changing pedagogy makes a huge impact? There's starting to be. In fact, there has been for a while. In fact, a paper from Washington in the Proceeds of the National Academy of Sciences in 2013 is an interesting one. I've given you the reference to it. You can chase it up. I'll give you that URL later on. They found in science, engineering, and mathematics, if the students were given active learning activities before face-to-face, that there would be a great improvement in performance. Let me just tell you what that boiled down to, my summary sentence. Out of 100 students, typically 34 will fail if only attending a lecture in these areas, in their university. When active learning was introduced, that number changed to 22. I think that's statistically significant, as is the finding from the University of British Columbia. Again, in subjects that have high failure rate, in this case, a physics prereq for engineering students. Now, they were having huge trouble and they needed to change things. Let me explain this graph. So the control group in blue are the ones who attended lectures only. Here we see the test scores. As you can see, they were bombing out big time. The experimental group are folks who had access to material before, aka the flipped classroom. Can be called deliberate learning, in other words, getting them into active learning. The jargon out there in the learning and teaching space is prolific. But there was a huge change. In fact, 41% failure rate, so they're still struggling with physics, but with lecture only, it was 72%. So a huge variation. Something to think about how we might change. Now, no one here is an economics specialist, I'm guessing. I didn't see any hands when I spoke business. But you might argue that's the Hawthorne effect. So post-World War II, there was a study of productivity, and they found that if anything was changed in the production cycle, productivity would improve. And maybe it is the Hawthorne effect, but it makes me wonder why we don't change things then, if that's the reason. So let's now focus on content. Now, content can be boiled down to a couple of areas. E-books, very topical. So we'll focus on e-books as pretty tightly. Apps. There's well over 1 million apps that you can use on the iPad. I can't keep up with them. You can't keep up with them. The other buzzword I want to use is communities of practice are important. In successful rollouts of projects, universities have started to get communities of practice of academic staff and sometimes include the students who discuss, who shortlist apps that are appropriate, that talk about what works and what doesn't, more on that later. And then I'm going to talk about open educational resources, OER, another big movement in the tertiary space. So let's start with apps. I had the pleasure of visiting University of California, Irvine Med School 18 months ago. And these guys have given every student an iPad. What's the impact been? Well, the first bit of impact was a very physical impact. They needed to make some changes. The first change they made was to their white coat so that it could fit the largest iPad. They've since moved to iPad minis, so that's not as big a deal. Now, the Dean tells me, though, that there's also been an impact on student learning. Bottom line, students going to UC Irvine are reasonably average when compared to national applications for med schools. However, a year after the iMed Ed project, students are now performing on average 23% higher on their national exams compared to the national cohort. Is it just the iPad that's done that? No, the iPad acted as a trigger and a tool to enhance teaching. They changed their pedagogy to small group learning. They moved away from large lectures to small group learning, continuing with PBLs, problem-based learning, which the clinical folks love. Now, the sort of apps they used are interesting. They use surveying and polling apps. So I've mentioned Turning Point's ResponseWare. They also used iResponse. They used something called mind mapping apps. And the way they use them, they use Poplet. That's one we're going to show you. The way they used it in med school was tutor turned up and said, right, patient presents with, and up came on the screen in an image of these few words, distended liver, lethargy, high serum ferritin. What's going on, guys? And the students would actually type in their iPads in a mind map what they gave as a differential diagnosis. Hemochromatosis, hepatitis B, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, and that's where the lesson went for the day, looking at those differential diagnoses. Now, reference tools, there are too many to talk about. A couple of you are from health sciences, you've discovered that. Whether it's in optometry, a lovely virtual eye chart, or some radiology software or anatomy software, there's a lot out there. And med schools, in particular, have embraced the iPad. Harvard give all of their students iPads as well. Gets rid of that equity issue that plagues a lot of us. They pay for them. And looking at what the students use for note-taking, I think is quite handy. So they're the apps that they use. Notability, Evernote, iAnnotate PDF, Goodreader. There are dozens of note-taking and PDF annotation apps out there. One of the findings here I think is worth sharing, and that is that in their preclinical years, when they're sitting in on lectures and seminars, they're annotating PDFs more than anything. But as soon as they get by the bedside, as soon as they're in the ward, they start taking more notes. So it's an interesting change in the way they're using things. Let's now stick to health science, get away from medicine. Let's get a bit preclinical here and talk about anatomy. University of Adelaide, again in Australia, Mario Ricci there has done some really interesting stuff with assessment. He's basically enhanced PDFs on his PC or Mac and uses them on his iPad to grade students in their anatomy pracs in real time. So he goes through on the iPad, gives them a grade, marking rubric, selects who the heck he is, presses a button, that goes out as a PDF to the student via email. Why is that important? I've already cited some work from John Hattie and others believe that the more timely the feedback, the higher the student motivation and achievement. So using these sorts of tools I think is very, very important. And engineers agree. So at the University of New South Wales, they've written their own app to grade students in group work. Let them explain why.
Hi, my name is Tim White. I'm the lecturer looking after the mechanical part of ENG1000, which is the faculty-wide engineering, design and innovation course in the Faculty of Engineering at the Uni of New South Wales. As part of ENG1000, students are required to take part in a team-based design and build activity. They're put into teams of 4 or 5. The teams are randomly selected at the start of session, and over the next 12 weeks or so of session, they need to work together and build a vehicle that's required to transport some kind of material from point A to point B on the track. In ENG1000, in Medicine, usually that's about 40 teams. and each of those sheets has the marks of the various criteria on it. Somebody then has to sit down and transfer all those marks across the spreadsheet. The most obvious problem with that system is that it's quite time consuming to transfer the marks across. Also, almost all pages there'll be at least one or two numbers won't be transcribed properly. And just the fact that paper can easily go missing, especially when you have 4 or 5 markers.
I'm Vivian Moore. I'm the tutor for Entrance 2000 this semester, and I'm part of the mechanical stream. So 30 teams came through, and yeah, the mock is really successful. It's really easy, really intuitive to use.
An important take back actually was it used to take them a week to get the grades to the students. Now they actually get them the next day. So it's made a big difference in that timely information. Let's make a little shift here from engineering to the humanities, to Chinese language teaching at Northwestern University. Here a student talks about his favourite apps. That's okay. But the best part for me was the fact that they are using the iPad to create content. He'll explain it. Keep your ear open at how they're using it.
The one that I liked the most that we used was the Chinagram one. It breaks down the character and it shows not only what the current character is, but what the original characters were. And it breaks down where it came from, and then also all those relations to other characters that are similar or the same or have same parts or comparable meanings. This other program, it's called Playgo. It has an optical recognizing. And it will, if you put this little green box up to a character, it has a really, really, really good ability to recognize it. And it'll give you the Chinese definition and the English definition and all this stuff. With this, we've been doing like recording speech and sending it in for files so she can listen to us and then give us personal feedback, individual feedback. And I think stuff like that has really been helpful too. It kind of, not only for the learning aspect of it, but it helps get the students engaged. I honestly think,
although I'd argue engagement correlates directly with student learning. So creating content. Now, music app, GarageBand, you might think that's fine if I'm from the Conservatorium of Music, but I've seen folks use it for creating podcasts, for putting audio tracks over video, for doing all sorts of groovy stuff, to use technical terms. But to give you an idea of the fact that this has been around a while, it's about 2 to 3 years ago that here in Johannesburg, the National School of the Arts were using the wonderful virtual instruments that are available on GarageBand. And that brings back memories for the core group because they were deeply involved with that. Then there's movie making. Is it just for folks in film schools? The University of Western Sydney Med School is part of the community placement program. The med students are creating videos about their experience. I think video can be used across disciplines quite appropriately. The iPad is a high-definition camera. Now, the camera we have over here costs a squillion rand. An iPad does not cost a squillion rand. Having said that, is it just for high-end use? Well, you can actually tart up the iPad by adding all sorts of add-ons like the iographer case, LED lighting, microphones. It's all about the sound, by the way, when it comes to video, lighting and sound, and lenses. Can only the technically savvy use this? I don't think so. I've seen some great examples of what's being called citizenship journalism, in some cases in remote communities.
In February 2011, in remote Northern Australia, an innovative mobile journalism program
The Catholic nuns have always been part of our life.
gave a group of Indigenous people living in isolated communities
Every Monday to Friday.
the technology and the skills to enable them to tell mobile stories
Enjoy your sport, madam.
from their own perspective.
You'll be proud to know that
The program was called Anti-Mojo.
And again, I've given the link to that so you can chase up. Now, there's been a lot of work around looking at different academic disciplines and how they're using iPad. Tom Cochrane's an academic now at AUT University in Auckland in New Zealand. He was at Unitec when this paper was published, looking at business education, architecture and music. And what they did is they actually mapped the iPad capability, be it the geolocation, the GPS chip, to a social constructivist finding. So look, for example, I think this is a good one, Harrington and Harrington from Western Australia from memory, their situated learning. They then map that through to Google Maps and how they use Google Maps in these sorts of environments. And I'm seeing some really cool new developments occur, like augmented reality. For example, let's hark back to University of Western Sydney. In social geography, they take the students out on field trips. They've all got iPads, and this is one of the meetings, they showed me how it worked. The students went out and lifted the camera up to look at a building in central Sydney. That linked back using an app called Erasma to material the teacher had put online in real time. So lift the camera up and it linked back to historical footage, to more information. In anatomy, I've seen this being used. At Nanyang Technical University in Singapore, they're using this for gross anatomy because there's a shortage of cadavers, a very practical reason. And in one situation, in fact, I'd like to show you this one, they've written an app in Tasmania for environmental science. So what I'm going to do is swap on over to my iPad. Now, I didn't explain this before, but there's the wonderful capability to mirror these devices. I'll just look at a code, 9022, in the classroom so that you're freed from cables and I could walk around the classroom. Johannesburg University have I should wake up my computer when I do that. Johannesburg have got 50 that they're setting up within lecture spaces so that staff can do this sort of stuff. So I'm going to use this wonderful report on the Tamar Estuary's health. That's the report. But using augmented reality apps, and I'll just find it here. It's AR, there it is, Tamar. I'm going to use my camera. So camera's working, obviously, there you guys are. I'm going to come up to the report, skip some of the intro stuff, point it at the map, and suddenly we're going to have some information come up, but we have augmented reality by having a look at the different zones. I can see how the grades have gone. In fact, I might explore zone 4. Now to do that, more information, I have actually changed it so I've got a virtual world here. So there you guys are in the background. Let's go on in there. Now I don't need to be attached to the map anymore. I'm going to look around zone 4. Using the gyroscope, I can actually get some information happening. Sponge garden. Oh, fish. But I can link to all sorts of interesting information that they've set up using this app. I won't eat shellfish there. I'm sure there's bad pollutants happening. And how's the weather up there? Gives you an idea of how augmented reality is being used in multiple disciplines. It's really, I think, fascinating stuff. So I'll just jump off the Wi-Fi.